What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today we're going to be checking out the HX Stomp. I've updated the firmware to 3.51, which is supposed to have some new cabs, and I decided that this was a good time to make a patch from scratch, and hopefully this will help out some folks who have been asking me if I could go over how I make patches from scratch. So the first thing to note though is we want to make sure we have all the cables necessary for this. I'm going to be using the desktop editor for this thing, which is called the HX Edit, and you'll see that on screen in a bit. We want to make sure you have that USB, I think this is a USB-B port to USB-A. And then you want to make sure that if you're either using this as an interface or if you're using audio interface itself, you're going to need a cable that goes from the output here to your interface, or you're going to have to enable the HX Stomp as an audio interface in your control panel settings. So yeah, let's try to make a preset from this from scratch. All right, so this is HX Edit, and I'm typically very much used to using the desktop editors for editing my patches. If you want to find a channel that's really good about making patches on the device itself, I would recommend checking out John Nathan Cordy's channel. He's basically kind of the HX Stomp master, but I want to go over just kind of how I do it for high gain and metal. So first things first, we want to make sure that we have the input and output working. So you should be hearing kind of a DI signal with no other blocks in between these two pads. So that's the DI sound, and we're going to be adding amps and drives and other sort of things to it in order to make it sound good for metal. The first few blocks I would want to put into this right here is the noise gate, the amp block, and the cab block. So let's put in a noise gate, which under here is under dynamics, I believe. And you can let's put a horizon gate in there, and this is based on the Horizon Devices. I don't know what the Horizon Devices gate is called. But it's based on one of Misha Mansour's, I guess, pedals. We're going to put that there like about third from last in the chain because we might have some effects that we want to put after that. The next thing we want to put down is an amp block. So I'm going to put down a PV5150, which is a very common amp that folks are using for metal. And this is a great amp to start with. The Boss Katana, for example, also uses a 5150 for its brown channel, which is I think what most people use for metal. About the third block in, we're going to select that amp. And you'll see the noise gate's important because if we turned off the noise gate, there's a ton of sound now. And then I'm also going to turn on this input gate on the main right here, and that will just get rid of all the sound for you. All right, so right after the amp, I always recommend folks put a cab. I'm going to put about 2 blocks after the amp because I might want to put an EQ in between the amp and the cab, which simulates kind of putting an EQ pedal in the effects return of an amp. All right, for the cab, we're going to choose a 4x12 Kali V30, which is a very common 4x12 cabinet used in metal. We're going to put in a 57 dynamic mic here. Cap edge is usually pretty much perfect. I would, for now, leave all these as they are, and then this should be enough for us to get like a basic tone going. So I would select the amp. All right, I'm actually going to reduce the gate from 8 to about 6-ish, and let's start dialing in the amp. And so what you hear is a very distorted tone, but it's also kind of fizzy and it's kind of muddy at the same time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my drive. 5.3 on a dial for a 5150 is actually pretty high. I think most folks who run 5150s really don't go past 4. So I'm going to put this at like 3.5, and we're going to see how the gain sounds now. So now you hear that the low end is a little bit tighter. You're not using as much gain, so it's not flubbing the bass too much into muddiness. If you have too much gain, it tends to do that. I think there's a little too much mids. So I'm going to lower the mids a little bit, probably to like 4.5-ish. So adjusting the bass before you add an overdrive, which we'll get into shortly, is kind of it's a little bit difficult. Basically, what I usually look for in an amp is to make sure the bass is high enough to where I feel an impact. If you lower the bass on the amp itself, you're going to lose a lot of bass frequencies, including the ones that you might want to give like impact to your low like chugs. The one thing I would say is play around with the master volume also. So on tube amplifiers, let's say you're on a 50 watt amp, those 50 watts are actually measured for clean. On tube amplifiers though, they will keep going, and because of the way that tubes distort, it's actually like pleasant to our ears. So a lot of like older amps, they crank them in order to get that slight breakup. So, but for metal, what we might want to do is to lower that and rely more on preamp gain, which is the drive right here. So the master will control power amp gain, which is the gain from the tubes that are providing the volume. And then the drive is the preamp, which is the portion where you're controlling how much distortion and how much EQ is going into that power amp section. So I'm going to lower the master by just a little bit. So treble and presence. So think about treble as your high frequencies within sort of the 2 kilohertz to maybe about 8 kilohertz. And what this is basically it's going to affect the amount of high-end fizz that you're going to hear in the amp. So if I raise the treble while holding a chord, you hear that extra fizz coming in. And that can sometimes get unpleasant. So what you do is you counteract it with presence. You dial down the presence so you can get a little bit of that grind from the treble without it being too harsh. However, what I'm going to do is also the opposite. So I'm going to crank the presence a little bit and lower that treble back to 1. So play around with the treble and presence settings. There's usually like a good balance between the two. More treble is kind of more texture, and then less treble and more presence is going to be more punchier and in your face. You might get to the point where higher notes will get kind of nasty, so just be careful about how much you push. So when you're just using an amp, you're relying on just one sort of compression. And what a lot of folks do is they add an overdrive in the front. So what an overdrive can do is it can tighten up your amp. And what that means is it takes away a lot of the low frequencies, but only the ones that you don't need. And it will also push some frequencies in the mids and upper mids that can help the guitar sound just more punchy and a little bit more cutting. So this is under distortion in the HX Stomp. Let's just use a tube screamer, which is a very common one that people use with high gain amps. And I think on the HX Stomp, it's called the Scream 808. And you see here that it already has gain on this setting right here. And some people like to mix the gain from the pedal into the amp, but basically what you want to do is you want to find that perfect amount of gain between the pedal and the amp. And a lot of folks like to just use the gain from the amps strictly and just rely on the pedal as sort of a tone shaping device. So what that sounds like is if we were to turn down the gain, up the level so we can get the full effect of that pedal's kind of tone shaping and kind of adjust the tone to our liking. So without the boost, so it's a little flubbier, it's not quite as high gain. And then actually when you add, even with no gain on the pedal, when you add that level, you're actually adding gain to the amp. So I would actually lower the gain in the amp a little bit. And that's a tone I can actually just work with. Earlier I was saying you can kind of stack the gain the way that you want. And so let's say if we were to put the drive even lower, I'm going to have this drive at 1. So it's like barely any drive. And then the distortion pedal, we're going to add some gain to it. So we're going to push it to like maybe like 4. And that's like a really like fun thing to mess with too, is what kind of gain do you want? If you rely more on pedal gain, you can get more of a sort of direct but not quite as open sound and something that's a little bit more compressed. Or if you use the amp gain, you can use something that's a little bit more what they say natural feeling, which just means that there's nice harmonics going on in the tone. For me, I typically actually like to keep the tube screamer at 0 and then give a little bit more amp gain. On the HX Stomp, you have 8 blocks here, and I'm using about only half of those. So let's add some EQ. And what EQ is going to do is it's going to further shape the tone that you're looking for. So in between the amp and the cab block, let's add an EQ here. Let's use a 10-band graphic. So with this EQ, I'm going to actually listen to the tone itself and kind of call out a few things that I'm noticing. Alright, so it's a little boxy, and kind of boxy is like a mid to lower mid kind of thing. So here I'm going to reduce 500 Hz by just like maybe 2.5 dB. You hear that it's kind of opened up in the low end a little bit. And then the other thing I feel like is there's not enough upper mid aggression. So we're going to push 2K, which is a great place to push for guitars, by the way, by just about 2 dB. That sounds really good. At this point, this would be all I would use for a distortion sort of channel. All right, so what other things can we add to this, right? So we have one block before the amp block here, and then we have basically empty blocks at the end. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna make a clean tone as well. So what I actually will do though is I'm going to select Snapshot 2, and in Snapshot 2, I'm gonna turn off the distortion and the amp and the EQ. So these 3 blocks are going to be turned off, and then we're going to add we could add another amp. So one of my favorite is a deluxe reverb. We're going to use this US Deluxe NURM, which I think just means normal. And this is what it sounds like. So the gate is still on, so we're going to turn off the gate for this patch too. That's a pretty easy, like, clean sound from a deluxe reverb. I typically use deluxe reverbs on my cleans all the time, but let's add a little bit something more to that. Let's add some reverb. And so the very last block, I'm going to put a reverb onto there. I'm just going to use the Ganymede. I have no clue what that pedal is based on. That should add some reverb for us. That's a lot of reverb. I'm going to pull it down a little bit. So when it comes to reverb, or even just amp distortion, we talk about wet and dry sounds. A wet sound is like an altered sound, like how altered is the sound. So when we're talking about effects, we're definitely talking about wet. And what the mix is here is how much of the wet signal do you want versus the dry signal. So the wet signal would be all the reverb. So if we did 100% mix, that's a pretty cool effect, and it's just the reverb, and you don't hear any of the direct mix. If you actually put it at 0, you don't hear any reverb at all. That's the dry. So I'm going to put the mix at about 15%. I think that's going to be about perfect for me. So you hear a little bit of the trail at the end, but not enough to where it's like overwhelming the sound. I'm going to save this to Snapshot 2. So how current modelers work is that you have presets and you have scenes or snapshots. You can switch between presets, but if you have too many different variables, you're going to run into gaps. So a majority of the time, you're actually going to have a gap in the sound itself if you switch presets. So the way that Line 6, Fractal, Neural have gotten around that is they allow you to switch different parts of your preset without latency. And so that's what the snapshot feature is for the HX Stomp. So we're going to go back to Snapshot 1, and we're going to turn off all the other things we added for Snapshot 2. And so when we go back to Snapshot 2, you'll see that only the blocks that we need for the clean tone are on. And then when we go to Snapshot 1, only the blocks that I need for the distortion tone are on. We still have one more block, so we still have kind of space to work if we want to put any additional effects in it. So I've assigned my snapshots to the foot switches on the HX Stomp, and that's done through the command center. You can assign whatever switches do per snapshot, so you can actually have them do different things for the same foot switch depending on what snapshot you're in. For now, I have, for both snapshots, I have the same 2 switches that enable Snapshot 1 and Snapshot 2. So you'll notice that when I hit the snapshot for the distorted tone, it's going to change all these blocks and take my tone from clean to distorted without any gap. And so yeah, I have effectively 2 tones that I can use, and let's make a third one now. So for lead playing, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times with the treble and the presence controls in the amp, you can get kind of piercing highs. And it's just too bright, right? So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to create a third snapshot. So in that empty block, let's add a EQ. And I'm going to do actually a low and high cut. We're going to high cut down to about, I want to say 69, 6.9 kilohertz. And then low cut, I'm going to do about 150. So basically what we're doing is we're still keeping a chunk of the guitar tone, but we're just lopping off the highs and the lows so that we have a more focused sound. I'm going to push the level by about 4 dB. And then we're going to do something with the snapshot controller. So on the reverb, if you right click the word mix here, you can actually set it to snapshots. So what this means is that only for this snapshot will this assignment be done. So if we were to increase this by like another 15%, so up to 30, and then save the preset. So if you go from this snapshot 3, which is our lead, back to snapshot 2, which is our clean, you'll see that this mix has turned down to 15. So you'll see here the controller here, it tells you sort of what's going on and what parameter is being changed by this controller. Now with all that said, let's go back to that snapshot with our lead tone, and this is what it sounds like. So yeah, that's a pretty good lead tone. I might roll the reverb down a little bit for this, but that's basically kind of in the ballpark of where I would want a lead tone. Make sure every time you add a block, by the way, to go back through your previous snapshots and make sure if you want it or not to turn them on and off. All right, so I've also set that one in the foot controller. So now I can actually switch between a clean, a distorted, and a lead tone without any delay. Yeah, that's the HX Stomp setting up a preset from scratch. I could do a whole gig with this if I just have those 3 presets. And I think the HX Stomp specifically is a great tool to start when you need kind of a gig ready sort of device, but also have it be kind of user-friendly. I highly recommend experimenting with the amps, the cabs, and the drives, because I just love seeing what people do differently than other people. I think it's what sets all of us apart from each other as musicians, and I love seeing people find a really cool tone for themselves. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. Hope this video was helpful for anyone who's looking to kind of get into guitar, specifically the guitar amp modeling world. Once again, I highly recommend John Nathan Cordy's videos on the HX Stomp. They have been invaluable for me. So yeah, if you like this kind of content, please consider hitting subscribe and like, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Later!